There we go. Right, so, oh, I love it when it's a small group because it means I feel like I'm giving you so much more close attention. So has anybody done any patchwork at all before?
Yeah.
No,
So I think Leslie with a bit of a nod. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
No.
Is that like hand, or is that paper piecing, or is it machine?
Bits of lots of things. So I just want to consolidate it, really.
Okay, brilliant. And then Eileen and Nicola, I think that was a no.
No.
And Jane and is it Yana? Do I pronounce your name?
Yes.
Was that a no as well?
I've done a little bit, but it was a very complicated one.
Okay.
So I didn't get very far.
Yeah. Do you know what? It's really funny because it's well worth just honing your technique with the basics and then going to something more complicated. So I'm going to do so. It's a little bit different to what I had intended on this workshop, because I was thinking about it this afternoon. And I thought, you know what, I can show two things. I can show really basic and then the next step as well, so that everybody can kind of just get to grips with everything first and then move on, because there are so many, and we're just going to do patchwork today, by the way. We're not going to do quilting, we're just going to do patchwork. So it's two quite different things. So patchwork is the process of joining pieces of fabric together to make something beautiful and larger, and then the quilting element is then is attaching layers together with stitching through a minimum of 2 layers, usually 3, to add like strength and depth to the piece. And there's quite a lot just in patchwork. So that's what I'm going to go through today. And then I can talk a little bit perhaps about quilting as well at the end if you'd like me to, if there's time. But I don't want to scrimp on the patchwork bit because there's quite a lot to cover. So let me get what I'm going to do is I'm not going to send you the handout now. I'm going to send it to you at the end, because if there's anything else that I add on throughout that you ask, I'll just add it on to the handout to make sure it's all in there. Yeah, and obviously I'll send you the recording as well. Oh, that's what I was going to say. So if anybody wants to make along, there are bits that you can probably do along with me at home. So usually I say, oh, watch, take it in, ask questions so that you don't get kind of behind on things. But there might, if you've got the right kit, there are kind of certain little bits of it tonight that you can probably do so along with if you would like to. No obligation, whatever you want to do. But yeah, we'll kind of just take it one step at a time. So we've got an hour and a half. Plenty to get through. So what I'm going to talk you through first of all is the kit that you need to do patchwork. So you definitely need a rotary cutter to do patchwork and quilting. It's a must, really. Like, it's a real game changer in terms of your accuracy, and it just means you cut out much faster. It takes a really long time to do all of the cutting out. So to have one of these just makes so much difference. And there are certain things, so the cutting and the measuring and the ironing, if you do all of those steps really well, it means that the final effect and the neatness and the precision on your actual sewing is going to be completely different if you take time and care with those steps at the beginning. So rotary cutter, a quilting ruler. I've got a couple of different ones here. I've got a really big one, and then I've got a smaller one as well. They both work absolutely fine. And then a cutting mat, self-healing cutting mat. This is a A3 one. I've got a really large one on my desk as well, but this one's fine. And actually I've got a link. I was doing a bit of searching earlier, and if you haven't got that kit, those 3 things which are indispensable, I've got a link for a really good deal for somewhere to get these 3 things exactly this size of mat online, which I'll include in the email afterwards. It tends to be all in imperial patchwork and quilting, because it's all American, really. It's a very American thing to do. You can get really into patchwork. I mean, my mum is kind of she does it most days. She's a diehard, amazing patchwork and quilter. I'm not. I really enjoy it, but I just make the odd project every now and then. But you'll find that a lot of people they kind of just get really into it. It's really lovely. It's a lovely community. But it's very much like roots these days are in America. So that's why everything is in imperial. So it will all be in inches and quarter inches and things like that. So the mat has got metric on one side and imperial on the other, but a lot of the rulers will just have imperial on. So that's kind of the main sort of specialist kit. Oh, Lauren's here as well. That's nice. Other than that, obviously you need your fabric. So I'll talk about different types of fabric in a moment. You need your thread. We'll talk about the threads as well. I don't use pins for, oh, someone else has come as well. Patty is also here. Let's just see. Hi, Lauren. Hope you're well. I'm recording. Don't worry, you've not missed very much. Nice to see you. And Patty's here as well. Hey, Patty. Nice to see you too. You've not missed very much, don't worry. I've just been talking about kit, but I'm recording it, so I'll send it out to you, so don't worry. So for patchwork and quilting, I don't use pins. I use the little fabric clips that you can get, because you just want to keep everything as flat as possible, and you quite often rely on the fabric layers kind of sticking together and holding together. So if you start putting pins in, you can easily start to distort things and move things around. So I don't always use these clips, but I always use them if I'm doing patchwork and quilting. And then obviously your sewing machine, and an iron is indispensable as well, and also a fabric pen. Oh, where did I put the one? There we go. So I'm using a friction pen. I really like these. I think pens are better than tailor's chalk in the instance of patchwork, because it's good to be really precise. And I really like these friction pens because they just iron off. But the water soluble pens like this one are also absolutely fine. So that's what you need in terms of kit. I've talked about the fact that we're going to do patchwork rather than quilting today. So in terms of fabric, I've actually made quilts using all sorts. I've made little things, patchwork bags out of denim, all sorts of things. Cotton is the traditional fabric to use. So like cotton lawn or just quilting cotton. So it's not too heavyweight. It's definitely not too lightweight. You want a certain kind of thread count. So it needs to be quite stable. If you're using a fabric that's not very stable, then you can use like a starch spray to try and give it a little bit more stability. I don't tend to do that. I just usually use fabrics that I wouldn't use anything for patchwork and quilting that's too flimsy or too thin or too lightweight and doesn't have that stability. So with cotton like this, actually, if you put two layers on top of each other, they don't really move around too much. They are nice and kind of secure and stable on each other. So that's really, really good. It's important when you're making one project to use all fabrics that are of the same or very, very similar weight. If you start to add things in which are of a really different weight, it will just get slightly puckered and it won't be as neat. It's very, very important to pre-wash. I think it is. Not all patchwork and quilters do, but most do. I think it's really important to pre-wash. And that's because you just want to eliminate any type of shrinkage. If you imagine you have things all stitched together and there'll be bits that are completely enclosed, and if that piece shrinks more than the bits that are all around it, then it will all kind of be a bit off. So you need to pre-wash and dry and press fabric before you do any patchwork and quilting. So I was talking about cotton being the best. I think it is the best thing to use, and certainly natural fibres are the best fabrics to use. Linen is also really nice as well. I've made items using linen before. It can be a little bit more less well behaved, so you might want to start to spray that. It depends on the how it's woven. Okay, so that's kit and fabric. So I'm going to get started, I think. Let me make sure my overhead camera's in, because there's going to be quite a lot of overhead stuff today. So when I used to teach this workshop, like face-to-face in Bath and in London, there were two workshops we used to do, actually. So we used to do like triangular patchwork cushion, and we also used to do like a square, larger kind of mini quilt. I'm going to show you how to do both today, because it's easier to sew together squares and rectangles. So that's definitely the best place for you to start. But then I'm also, once I've cut out a few squares, I'll show you how to sew those together, but then I'll also show you how to do like half square triangles as well, because then if you've got the knowledge to do both of those, you could make some really interesting just kind of simple cushion covers or bags or mini quilts or whatever, or big quilts using just squares and triangles. And I'll put some inspiration for the types of things that you could do in the handout that I send you, so that you can see that the skills that you've learned, actually, you could make some really amazing things with that. So first thing we need to do is cut out some fabric. So where's my larger piece? Where did I put? Oh, here they are. Okay, so these pieces of fabric here, I've already kind of cut them down so that they are, what I'm going to cut out is some 5-inch squares. You need to have, basically, you need to add an inch onto, actually, for triangles, for half square triangles, you need to add an inch on. For squares, you need to add half an inch on. I'm cutting out 5-inch squares today. So what I've done is I've cut out some strips that are wider and certainly a lot longer than 5 inches to begin with, so that I can show you the process of cutting. I think I'll do the yellow because that's going to stand out the best against my mat. Maybe that green as well. Oops, take these other ones aside. So, oops. There we go. So these are washed and they're pressed. So they're good to go. Could be pressed a little bit better, but they are pressed. So I'm going to switch to my overhead camera now. Oh. Hang on. Thought it was that. Oh, you get to see the behind the scenes of the messy desk. Right, actually, that's the other thing to say is it's really good practice to have a nice clear desk when you're doing this, because any kind of, you know, lumps and bumps and things that are in the way, you need quite a lot of space for it. So I would recommend not doing it on camera with lots of people and having to have lots of, I've got an iron here, a sewing machine here, a computer here. That's not ideal. Right, so I want to cut this out as a 5-inch square. So I've cut it out slightly smaller just to make my life a little bit easier, but also, but I would do that anyway. I can see that this line down here is slightly off the grain of the fabric. You won't be able to see that from where you are. Actually, you might. You can see that there's lots of, can you see here? There's bits coming up. So that's not a perfectly straight line up with the grain of the fabric. So what I'm going to do is just grab a thread from down here and pull it all the way up. And that will give me, oops. There we go. Try not to do them all at once. There we go. So I can see now that line is the straight grain of the fabric. If this was cut along the selve edge, then you'd know that that edge would be nice and straight. But because this wasn't, I kind of made a new edge along with the grain of the fabric just by pulling some of those strands out. If this was a really large piece of fabric, you wouldn't have been able to do that, but because it's only small, it's really easy to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is slice down there in line with this so that I know that the edge of the fabric is perfectly straight. So when you are cutting fabrics out on your cutting mat with your rotary cutter, I'm going to stand up now because it's important that you do stand up, because you want your weight to be leaning straight down onto your ruler, onto your fabric. If it's, well, my camera keeps just slightly heading northwards. Hopefully it's still okay for you. if you're kind of sitting down, you'll also, even if you don't think you are, you'll be pushing slightly in that direction, but you want to be pushing directly down onto your ruler and onto your fabric so that things don't start to move around at all. So let me stand up and show you how I'm going to line things up. So there are lots and lots of lines going in both directions and some diagonal actually on my cutting mat. What I'm going to do is line up the natural edge of the fabric at the top and the bottom with just, it doesn't matter which line, actually, let's use that 10 line there. This is a nice brand new mat. So all the lines are nice and crisp. On my old mats, you can see the lines that you favour to cut in and they start to kind of eat away on your mat. Okay, so the fabric there along this, so you'll see these bits here, these tufty bits that are left out, they are extending beyond that number 10 line. So if I slice, I'm going to put my ruler down, also in line with that 10 line. I'm going to put my hand down and I'm standing up, so I'm pushing weight directly downwards on my ruler, and then with my rotary cutter, they've usually got a little safety catch on them like that, so I'm going to pull that back so that the blade is now exposed, and you have it so that you always have your the excess of the fabric on the outside of the ruler. You'd never cut it so that, imagine if I was cutting along and then suddenly I was to veer slightly that way, that would mean that I would cut into my actual fabric that I wanted to use if I had my bulk of my fabric over here. So always have the excess bit on the right hand side, I guess, unless you're left-handed, and then have the blade edge, not that cover edge, but the blade edge facing your ruler. And then I'm going to start here just with the blade up against the ruler. And then you don't need to apply too much pressure at all because the rotary blades are very, very sharp. And then I just rolled it up, always away from you. And then I can just pull those bits. Pull those bits away. And now I know that that's a perfect edge for that piece of fabric. So I want it to be 5 inches this way. So what I'm going to do is line up the edge of the fabric with, I'll line it up with that 10 line again, just make sure I'm central for you. Is that central? Yeah, kind of is. Yeah. So that's that line that I've just cut, I'm going to line up with the 10 line on the left hand side, and then I'm going to put my ruler down here now. This is going to be the square that I'm cutting out, and I'm going to line up. Can you see this is the 15 line, so I know that this is 5 inches across. 1, 2, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to line up my ruler above and below the fabric in line with that 15 line, and again put my hand down nice and firmly, get my rotary cutter so I'm directly above the fabric, and I'm pushing quite a lot of pressure on my left hand on the fabric, but I'm not pressing very much pressure on my right hand with the cutter because I know that my blade's nice and sharp. Okay, so this is a 5-inch square in this direction, but now I just need to make sure I cut it in this direction as well. So place it back on the mat, and this time the top and the bottom lines are beautifully lined up with this line and this line here. And again, so I just need to cut down the 15 and the 10, or whichever ones you choose on your mat, to make sure that it's 5 inches or whatever size you want. You don't need to do 5 inches. I did it quite large because as you sew lots of pieces together, you lose obviously all the seam allowances. So the larger you make your squares, kind of the less you lose, you know, so the more kind of larger pieces of fabric. So I thought that would be quite sensible for today to have slightly larger squares so that there's more to show you at the end. Okay, and the last one, always the blade away from you. There we go. So we've got the first 5-inch square done. So I've obviously done lots more earlier. So I've got loads here that I've already done, but they're all 5-inch squares done in exactly the same way. They didn't actually take as long as you might think that they may have taken, because kind of once you get into the swing of things, like anything, you can speed up a little bit, but just take care, obviously, when you're using the rotary cutter, that you don't go too quickly. Okay, so what I am going to do first of all is start stitching some of these together so that I can show you what you would do if you were doing just squares or rectangles together. So you could have cut them any size that you like, doesn't matter, but if you are, always put your safety thing back on there, by the way, if you're keeping it to one side. Yeah, so first of all, we're going to do how you would sew together just squares. So, in terms of colours as well, I think that contrasting colours look really nice together on patchwork, because it means that the patchwork design really stands out. So this is one I did earlier with triangles there. And I just think it looks really nice having like the contrast, and I've got patterns and I've got solids as well. I think solids work really, really well in patchwork and quilting, because it means that you're really heralding the patchwork design by having solids, but equally patterns work really, really nicely as well. Again, in the handout, I'll include some inspiration for you so you can grab a few ideas, because there's so many different sort of styles and techniques that you can use. Right, so for squares, let me show you. What you need to do is, well, first of all, what you need to do is plan out your design. So say I wanted to do a, let's see, like a pot holder for my kitchen, something like that. Or like a pot stand, you know, something like that would look nice. If say that was the design I wanted to do. What you need to do then, once you've got your design figured out, it could be much, much larger than this, but the principle is exactly the same. You then take your design into strips. So this would be a strip. If there were, say, 4 or 5 down here, they would all be strip 1. If these were all 4 or 5 down here, this would be strip 2, and you could have more of those as well if you wanted to. And then what I tend to do, sometimes I even get my fabric pen and I'll write on them like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever, so that I don't lose the order, because sometimes you might not be doing a project all in one go. You might start it and then come back to it at a later time. So that would be like, so, or you could do like, say, column 1A, 1B, we could do it in tailor's chalk, 1C, etc. And then that would be 2A, 2B, etc. And that would mean that when you come back to make your quilt, you know which order they go in, so that you keep your design. But yeah, let me put this one to one side. So we'll work with column A first, first column, and the bottom 2. So we're going to join these 2 together first of all. So what you want to do is put them on top of each other with the right sides facing, and they should line up pretty beautifully if I've done my cutting correctly, which it looks like, thankfully I have. And then sometimes I don't even use the clips, because the cotton fabric is really quite stable. But to begin with, you can use clips. So I usually don't clip on the side that I'm going to sew, but just to hold the pieces of fabric together, I'll do a clip on the other 3 sides to make sure that the fabric doesn't start to misbehave. And then, so I know I'm going to do a line of stitching down this side here. And I haven't talked about threads. Which one do I do? One. Oh, trying to change my camera. Oh, did it? So for thread, I just think every now and then it's probably nice for you to have a, well, not to see my face, but you know, have a change of scenery. So threads wise, most patchwork and quilters will use cotton, because it's good to have the same material as what your actual fabric is. So I usually use cotton. I usually use quite a fine cotton. You don't want it to be too bulky because you don't want it to, you don't want the stitches to be showing in between your fabric. And color wise, if you've got lots of different colors on your quilt, on your piece of patchwork, then I would just choose something neutral. And I'd always go darker rather than lighter, because the darker threads will be more easily concealed than lighter threads. The lighter ones will show through much more easily. So something like a beige or a grey is quite good if you've got lots of different colours. I'm using cream today, but that is purely because I want you to be able to see my stitches. Otherwise, I would be using a darker thread on my sewing machine. In terms of the actual stitching, make sure I'm not missing anything out. I think we're doing okay. Yep. So in terms of the actual stitching, you want your machine set up to straight stitch, but about stitch length 3 usually is what I use for this. And it's really important that you sew nice straight lines, which is sometimes not as easy as it sounds. So the fact that you've pre-cut your fabric beautifully straight and you've taken care and attention over that is the first tip to helping you sew in a straight line. If you can go by a nice straight cut edge, then you stand a far greater chance of having a nice straight line of stitching. I would also say, if you've not changed your needle on your sewing machine for a little while, definitely change it before you start a project like this, because especially when I show you the triangles in a minute, there are certain places where the fabric can kind of go down into the plate a little bit if it's in a point. And so if you've got a nice sharp needle, it should just glide nice and quickly through the fabric. Go slowly as well. So if you've got a speed control on your sewing machine, I would always set that to slow for patchwork and quilting. And then the other thing to say, which is a bit unusual if you're a sewer, and it might be quite a hard habit to get into, but don't do reverse at the beginning and at the end, because you don't want to add bulk, you don't want to add puckering, you just need to kind of go straight into your stitching without adding any extra like that. You don't need to worry, it's not going to come undone. You're going to sew more lines through all of your stitches when you actually join them together even more, so it's okay. Okay, so over to the machine. In terms of the sewing bit, so the standard seam allowance for patchwork is 1/4 inch. Sorry, I'm just this in. There we go. I'll just change camera again. Oh, good. Actually, do you know what? I'm going to do 2 of these because there's another technique I wanted to show you. So that's 2A, 2B. So let's put those down on each other. Match those up. And put clips on the 3 sides that we don't want to stitch as well. There we go. So both of those are now ready for sewing along this edge and this edge. So I'll go over to my machine. So 1/4 inch seam allowance is what is the norm. So that's if you're using like a pattern, they will expect you to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But the 1/4 inch seam allowance is quite close to your stitching. It's quite often really hard to see. So I find it much easier that's my 1/4 inch line up there. It's really hard to see that, so I've added on a little piece of masking tape all the way down here so that I know as I sew along, if I just line up the edge of my fabric with that piece of masking tape, it's going to be so much easier for me to remain accurate. If you find it really hard to match up to that 1/4 inch line, I would say to you, unless you're kind of using a pattern which you've bought, if you're just doing something like squares or triangles or something like that, you will be okay if you use the edge of your presser foot as your seam allowance instead, because it's easier to do that. It obviously means your seam allowances are going to be larger, so your finished fabric pieces will be slightly smaller, but as long as you're very consistent throughout and you do that for every single piece, it means that everything will still line up okay. It will just be a little bit smaller. So it's up to you. If you find that a lot easier and you find it's really hard and you keep veering off when you're trying to line up with the 1/4 of an inch line, I would say to do that. Okay, so stitching. Do you know what? I think I'm going to have time to do some quilty stuff as well, because we're doing great for time, so that's good. Does anyone have any questions so far, by the way? Sorry, because it's a nice group. Please just say.
Could you draw a line for the stitching if you wanted to?
Yeah, you could draw a line for the stitching actually. So when I come to do the triangles, I do draw a line, which you'll see why. But you can definitely draw a line for your seam allowance as well if you wanted to. If you got the time and the inclination, absolutely. Right. Okay, so I'm going to line this up. I'm going to start just in from the edge, because so there are two things you can do here actually. So I'm going to start just in from the edge. The other thing you can do is you can get it's got a mind of its own, this thing. You can get a scrap of fabric and add on like a little sort of header piece. Had a load of scraps of fabric earlier. Where have they all gone? Oh, this will do. So this is just a little header piece of fabric. It's just literally just a scrap. And what you can do is pop that just in front of your other piece of fabric. So start stitching that first, and then go into your actual piece of fabric. And that just means, you know, sometimes at the very beginning of a line of stitching, the tension on your threads will kind of, you know, it needs to find that tension. So at the very beginning, it might be a little bit looser, it might be a little bit tight, the end of the thread might get caught up underneath and things like that. So by adding a little header piece at the very beginning of the first piece, it eliminates that problem. Right, I am sewing slightly on a squiffy angle here. So usually I wouldn't really mind, but I think I'm going to reposition myself slightly because I want to try and be more accurate than usually. I'm a bit slapdash. Okay, so I'm going to start my stitching. I'm on the right stitch length. We're all good. Ooh. So this is my header piece. I'm just going to do a few stitches down here. I'm on a nice slow speed. I'm going to line up my first piece with the seam allowance bit of tape that I've got there. And then I'm going to just line up. There's a tiny little gap in between my header piece and my other fabric, but that's good. Oop. And off we go. Okay, and then when you get towards the end, you can get your next piece and do what is, I think it's known as continuous sewing. That would make sense. And just go from one piece to the next piece to the next. So that saves quite a lot of time, and it also means that there's less chance of puckering. So kind of this piece is just sort of acting as the header piece for your next one, really. So there's less chance of all of your threads getting caught up and puckering. So and also it just, you know, it saves thread. It just means things are a lot more speedy. So I'll finish that first one. And then just literally carry straight on with my next one. And you can keep going. Sometimes I'll have a really long chain of pieces of fabric that I'm sewing together, which is another reason why writing on them where they fall in your design is a really good idea. And then when you get to the end, don't do any reverse. Just carefully pull the fabric out and snip it. Okay. So if I was making a really large quilt or cushion or something, obviously I'd have loads of pieces of fabric all in a long chain, but I've only got 2 today, and that little header piece. Just take the clips off. You'll sometimes find that there's a little bit of puckering. So it's a good idea to press at this point. You can obviously unstitch them. So press them at this point flat like this, and that kind of sets the seams in, and also just make sure that everything's nice and flat. So I'm gonna unfortunately unplug my heated blanket that's on my knees. It's still a little bit chilly out here in my studio, and turn my mini iron on. Okay, but that's kind of how you sew those together. The next job is to press them and then start the piecing together of the larger pieces. So I'm going to press flat first of all, because that is really good practice to do that. But I'll show you the step that we do after we've set the seam by pressing flat as well. And again, it's really good idea to take time to do this properly, because it will make a really big difference to your final piece. Actually, I'm going to go a bit hotter with my iron. So firstly, you're going to open it out, and then usually you will press the seam allowances towards the darker colour of fabric. But actually, occasionally I won't do that, because I think it's, depending on your design, sometimes you'll want to minimize. Imagine if you had lots of pieces kind of all joining at one point, and all of the seam allowances were going towards this side, because that's where all of the bulky fabric was, that's where all the darker fabric was. It would be much more bulky. So sometimes, like on this, where's that example gone? Here. This one here, all of these pieces where they joined in the middle, it was important that some of them were going one way and some of them were going another way. So I kind of varied it, although you can see most of these are going to the darker side. But yeah, so it's up to you. If in doubt, go to the darker side. But if you're concerned that you'll have really bulky bits of fabric, then you can mix it up a little bit. Right, my iron's ready, so I'm just going to press it first of all. And it's also another really important thing when you're pressing patchwork is not to, so normally you might do this and kind of move your iron around a little bit. With this, you just want to literally push it down and hold it there and lift it back up again. And that's just to eliminate any kind of distortion. And it does make a difference. Honestly, you'll see if you had large pieces of patchwork that you kind of moved your iron around, you'll see that it does distort the fabrics a little bit. Right, already that looks so much nicer and neater just having been pressed like that. Do the same with the other one. And then once you've set the seams by pressing like this, you need to open them out and then press them again towards the darker colour. Don't worry, that'll disappear in a mo. And the way that I do that is I kind of finger press the fabric first of all. So I'm going to open this out. I've got the fabric, the seam allowances facing the wrong side there. They're going towards the blue dotty. So I'll turn it over this way, and I'll just kind of, almost like you're sort of I don't know, playing a piano or something like that. I just kind of push it across like this, nice and evenly. So you're not pushing more in one direction than another, and just kind of push it across. And that means that it's nice and straight, but you've got no more fabric in there that you want to come out. And once you've done that bit of finger pressing, you can get your iron again and just press it down and hold it. And then that will mean that you've got a really nice, crisp, open square of fabric. Okay, that's that one done. And then do this one as well. There we go. Oops. There we go. If you've got, this is my Cricut mini press, and actually the larger easy presses from Cricut, I don't know, you might have one, Lauren, but they're really good for patchwork and quilting because they're kind of designed just to go down flat, and they've got a really nice large heat plate. And incidentally, if you have a Cricut maker machine, you can cut out your fabrics on there, which is a bit of a game changer. But I cut these out by hand today. Okay, so these two are now ready to sew together. So you might have several rows, and they might be much, much longer than this, but it's exactly the same principle as just having these. And you want to start at one end and start joining one row to the next row, and then those rows to the next row, and then those rows to the next row, like that, and just kind of work your way along. So this has worked really nicely. So I've got the dark fabric here and here. So the seam allowance on this one is pushed to this side, and this one is pushed to this side. So you can see when I lay these on top of each other, it's going to be really lovely because the seam allowances, we've never got we've only ever got 3 pieces of fabric. You know, the seam allowance is going in opposite directions. So that's going to work really, really nicely. So that's what you need to do. Put one on top of the other, right sides facing, for your whole rows that are next to each other, and just double check that your joins are kind of crossing really beautifully where the fabrics swap over. If you cut them really perfectly, it should work out really nicely anyway, but just double check, because if there's any doubt, it's better for you to have a little bit of a mismatch at the edge rather than where the crosses are, because the points where the fabrics meet is where it's going to be obvious if there are any, you know, things that you want to change. So I'm happy with that. That looks lovely. So again, I'm going to put some clips on the fabric. If you're doing a long row, I would put clips along your sewing edge and then take them out as you go along. But I think probably because this is a nice small piece of fabric, I might put one just down there towards the end. But otherwise, actually, do you know what? I'm going to put one there as well, just to hold that in place, because I'm happy with that positioning. There we go. And then one down there. Okay, just double check on the other side. Yeah, that's all good. Right, so now, same again. Start at the top with your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and this time sew all the way down. You need to be really careful when you're sewing over the points where the fabrics are pieced together, because you don't want to accidentally bring that over to that side, because it will just mean that your fabric is going to be a bit puckered. So just, that's another reason to go nice and slowly, take it easy, and actually I'm going to keep my eye on. Yeah, and make sure that you don't have any lumps and bumps. So back over to the sewing machine. There we go. And you could do that header piece again if you wanted to, but I'm going to go straight in. So remember, at the very beginning and at the very end, you're going to have like binding or something at the top, so you can start your very first stitch, you know, like a couple of millimeters in from the edge, if you'd like to. So that's what I'm going to do. Hold my threads, and then down we go. Remember, no reverse, just go straight in. There we go. Okay, so the same as before. Oop. Hang on. There we go. I'll take the clips off. And then we'll press the seam, like set the seam first of all, just by pressing flat on the line of stitching that we've done. And it is important to not, you know, miss out these steps. I'm not usually much of an ironer, but when it comes to things like this, it just makes such a difference. So it's really worth it. Okay, and then we can open it out. And this time, of course, I'd say that's probably the darker side. So I'll push to that side, but press it down. Thankfully, it's lovely, meets in the middle really beautifully, which is never not satisfying. However many you've made, you'll always just be so happy when you see that nice little meet up in the middle. At the same time, though, please don't beat yourself up or worry about it if you've got parts that don't match up beautifully, because I can promise you, even still now, many of mine don't match up as beautifully as I want them to. So it's like anything, you know, the more you do, the more practice you have, the better they'll be. So don't worry about it. But that's another reason really for starting off with squares or rectangles, because you've got a much greater chance of having them. Well, firstly, it's easier to cut them out really neatly, and then secondly, when you sew them together, there's just so much better chance of them meeting up. So you know, if you start off with something that's too fiddly, you might, you know, not be as pleased with yourself. So there we go. Right, so we've done squares and rectangles, and I could just keep going with this now, because I mean, I might just make it into a little pot or something like that, or you know, you could have it as a pocket on a bag. You can do whatever you want with it, but the process is exactly the same as large as you want to go. I'm going to show you now how to make what's called half square triangles. So that is what I used for the sample piece that I showed you earlier, this one here, which I've not pressed yet, so you can see it's still a little bit puckery. Because in patchwork and quilting, there are loads of little sort of shortcuts almost that you can do just to speed things up when you're sewing your fabric. So there are two, well, there are probably more than two, but two that I know of ways that you can make half square triangles and sew them together to make patchwork. So the first thing that you can do is you could cut out, I would always start out by cutting squares like this, and then you could put them onto your mat and cut them into triangles. So the way that you would do that, I'll stand up again so that it's, where's my ruler? Oh, here we go. So that I'm putting the right pressure on everything. So on your cutting mat, you'll see that there are various different diagonal lines, but one of the lines is at 45 degrees, and it's cutting, you know, directly on the diagonal through the squares. So if you line your square that you've cut up, I can line it up with this 5-inch square here, actually, from 5 to 10. And then what you would do is take your ruler, put it the right way around, and it is important that your ruler is the right way around, because it's got a little, because usually there's a little bit of friction on the bottom, because that's where the lines and the numbers are printed. So if you put that side down onto your fabric, because there's a little bit of friction under there, it's much easier to hold it still, whereas there's nothing on here. This side, the top is completely smooth, so if I was to put it down that way, it would move around much more easily. If you do find that your ruler moves around a bit on your fabric, you can put a tiny bit of like double-sided tape on the bottom, and it will lose its stickiness after a while, but you can have it there for quite a long time, and it will just kind of make sure that things don't slip and slide around. But if you're directly above your fabric, you should be okay. Okay, so I'm now, you see that diagonal line on my mat, if I line up that line with my ruler, then it means that I am bisecting my triangle perfectly in half on the diagonal, and you can get your rotary cutter. So directly above, and lots of pressure on your ruler, and not too much pressure and away from you with your rotary blade. And then you have got, wasn't doing enough pressure. That's annoying. I'm going to move it around a bit because I was on a bit of a funny angle then. I might need to change this blade, I suppose, but let's keep going for now. Do you know what? I'm going to get another one because I don't want to mess it up. Go. There. Better? There we go. So you can make triangles like that and sew them together, but the way that I favour is a little bit quicker, and so I'm going to show you that instead. So this time I'm going to take one of my squares and I'll still pop it onto my in that 5-inch square or whatever size you've got on your mat, and then I'm still going to line up my ruler with that diagonal 45-degree line, but this time instead of cutting down the middle, I'm going to take my fabric pen and draw a line down the middle instead. It helps. I always like to draw from one side into the middle and then draw from the other side into the middle as well, because otherwise sometimes if you go all the way down, it kind of it goes off a little bit, whereas if you do it that way, you get it perfectly from corner to corner. So we've got a line, hopefully you can see, drawing down the center of the triangle. I'll do a couple actually, so that we've got two. Let's do completely different colors. Mix it up a bit. I don't know what this one's going to look like, but hey ho, that'll be nice. A little surprise. So do another one, same again. Oops. There we go. Okay, so this time I'm going to take another fabric and still put my fabrics on top of each other, so match up two squares. So you'll need to do the planning in advance for this and think about it a little bit more carefully, but I'm going to just plow on because you know you can spend all day just talking about the designing. So I've put two squares on each other perfectly. The one on the top has got a diagonal line drawn on it. The one on the bottom hasn't got a line drawn on it at all. There's no need. Put a couple of clips on just to hold those in place. That should be enough. And this time, what I'm going to do is stitch two lines, one either side of the line that I've drawn on, 1/2 inch away. So one line of stitching 1/2 inch down this side and one line of stitching 1/2 inch down this side. And then if we just cut through the middle, we've saved ourselves a lot of time. And also actually, if you imagine stitching down these pieces of fabric instead, it's much easier to put this under your machine and stitch down here. It's just more bulky, it's a more stable piece of fabric to be putting under your sewing machine. Whereas if you have a piece of fabric like this, you can still do that header piece at the top, but actually there's a lot more chance that you'll get puckering at the top of this triangle rather than doing it with the square. There is a little tip that you can do, so you can snip off right at the very end so that it's not a you know, the point of the triangle going through your machine, and that will still be fine because you lose the tip anyway. But I think that this method is not only quicker, but it's also a little bit neater. So let's see, we've got pink, yellow, teal and red then, I guess. Put those on top of each other. So I'll do two again. Pin them. Oops, that one slipped. There we go. Okay, and then we'll go over to the sewing machine. This time it's harder to see because we've got fabric all the way along the bottom. So what you need to do is use the, and you might, again, this might be a reason for you not wanting to do it this way, completely up to you, but you need to use your presser foot rather than sorry. Rather than that tape. So if you imagine that goes underneath there now, I can't see the tape. So I can't see where my 1/4 of an inch point is on the bottom. So you need to figure out where the 1/4 of an inch point is on your presser foot, and it'll be different for everybody. It's actually really great on this one because I'll show you. The 1/4 of an inch point for me is on the left-hand side of this prong that comes out the top, this part of the foot here. So actually it's quite easy to see at this point, oops, at this point here, I want, that's going to be my seam allowance. So let me show you. Okay, so I'm going to line up, I'm going to stitch on the left-hand side of the line first of all, that I've drawn, and I'm going to line up that drawn line with that point on the right hand side of my presser foot, which hopefully you can see there. And then start stitching. I'm not going to do a header piece for this one, but you can do if you like. Just going to get straight in. Carry straight on with the other one, I think. It's a bit tricky with triangles, with, yeah, doing it like this. There we go. That's one in. Okay, and then we're going to do another line of stitching back down the other side of that line on both of those pieces. So back under the sewing machine, line it up where I know is the correct point on my presser foot, and off we go. There we go. Okay, so like before, is my iron still on? Yes, it is. You can see that they're a little bit puckered, but that's fine, that's normal, don't worry about it. But give them a press first of all to set those seams. It's my mat. So same as before, just press down. Oops. Oh, it's removing, because I've used friction pen, it's removing my pen because I'm pressing it. We don't need it anymore, so that's fine. It's like magic. Isn't that clever, hey? So that's one. I wouldn't usually use this tiny little iron, but it's just so much easier for when I'm showing you on here rather than lugging my big iron around. But usually that iron plate would cover all of that, so I wouldn't have those pieces there. Okay, so they're pressed like that, and now we just need to slice down the line that's disappeared, but that's okay. Doesn't need to be precise because this is all seam allowance now. So if I just put my pieces of fabric back onto the mat, you can just follow the lines on your mat. So put one on, and now we're going to slice through in between those two lines of stitching that you've done. Oops. One. Two. There we go. And then, much more speedily, you've already got 4 that you've done. So let's press those open as well. And I can show you how to stitch these together. So it's a really, and actually you could have like a design where you had used the squares and the triangles. So you could have like 2 triangles here, a square there, you know, you could really mix that up. It would look really lovely. But let's press on. So I'm going to do the finger pressing again towards the dark side of the fabric. How are we doing for time? Oh, we're doing okay. We're doing okay. I think I'm going to have time to talk a little bit about quilting and binding as well. So if that's something you're interested in, I can tell you a bit more about that too. Okay, 1. Somebody messaged me earlier today, it might be one of you, to say that they wanted to make a quilt, like a story quilt. Was that one of you?
No.
Was that you? No. I've got a couple of examples of quilts that I've got for my daughter that I didn't make, but my mum made. I'll show those to you in a minute, or both of my daughters, because they're really, really inspirational, really amazing. She's used all of these techniques, but she's also used quite a lot of applique as well. Right. Nearly done. So now, this is the fun bit. You can place your design. Actually, what you could do, if you'd like to, is trim these squares. I don't always do it, but sometimes I will trim off the seam allowances and make sure that everything's lined up properly. So you can do that if you'd like to, just to get rid of those bits. It's completely up to you. It does make things a little bit neater when you're stitching everything together. Oh, I'm rushing now, look. Let me not. Stop it, Kate. Stop it properly. There we go. So it's a bit neater and kind of just a little, you know, to do that rather than have all of these ends on, but I won't bother doing that for all of these. But next job, yeah, so you can plan how you want the design to look. So it's really funny, you wouldn't think it, but from just doing triangles like this, you can get so many different designs. So I did that one before, which was like a kind of a bit like a pinwheel, I guess, wasn't it? Like that type of thing. No, not like that, going round like that. But you could do like arrows. That looks really fun. Certainly if you've got like, say, black and white or something, you can have like kind of like arrows like that pointing in that direction. Or what else, just having them all going in the same direction. I don't know, like that. You can just play around with it for ages and the designs look so completely different. It's really, really fun. So yeah, I would say to you, definitely have, you know, honestly, it's crazy how different they look. So have a really good play around and just have a look at like grabbing inspiration off the internet and in books and things to see what types of designs you can get. I'll put some on your handouts as well now. I think I'm going to go for, well, let's have a vote. So let's not do pinwheel again because I did that one before. Let's either do arrows like that, or this diagonal. Oh, but look, you see, so if you had more of those, you could have like say if that was going like that, that would be a diagonal lines all the way down like that. Oh, honestly, just keep trying, doing all sorts of things. Yeah, so we're either going to do that or the arrows. Okay, cast your votes now. If you'd like to vote, you can put it in the chat, or you can just tell me who wants either arrows or diagonals. Okay, go. Are you typing? Or are you saying? Arrows, Lauren. Anyone out? Any more for any more? Oh, someone needs to have the deciding vote.
Arrows.
Arrows. Thanks. Sorry, Leslie.
That's all right. That's fine. I can't even spell.
So, like that and like that. So again, you can line them all up in rows like this. So this would, if I was marking them up, I'd do 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1E, 2A, B, da, 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 and then put them on top of each other in a methodical fashion. But again, let's line these up, and you're going to see this time it's much harder to get the point, everything lined up really, really beautifully. I always, obviously it should be a case of just putting the squares on top of each other, and because we've been so precise with all of our cutting out, it should match up really well. But I always just go in and double check again on the points where I'm going to be sewing to make sure that I'm happy that the fabric is where I want it to be, and then pop a couple of clips on. Oops, that slid around a bit. One there and one there. Actually, no, I'm going to stitch along that side, so I'm going to put one there and one here. And then this one is going to go like that. See? Right, we happy there? Yep, we're happy. Just put one there for now. Okay. So back over to the machine. Oops. Oops. So carefully pop it under, and I can use my nice tape guide again this time to make sure that everything's lined up as I want it. Quite a few layers of fabric at the beginning, that's why it's a bit more clunky. That's okay. So that's the first one done. And then, so you can see it's much nicer if you do cut those corners off. Probably would take time to do that if I have a bit more time. Oh, accidentally pressed reverse. Ignore that, you pretend you didn't see that. Okay. So just need to give them another press. So set the seam first of all. Oops, I've not moved you, sorry. Must have been a bit boring. Set the seam first of all quickly. Like that. And then getting the hang of this now. Do you know what? I am actually going to snip those off just to get rid of them, because you'll be able to see much more easily what we're doing. Trim all these ends off as we go as well. Okay, so let's open them out and hope that I've done it correctly. Yep, you. So again, finger press. Oh, I'm pleased with that. That's good. That's very satisfying. But it is, as you can see, like honestly, I practice first of all just with squares and rectangles, and then do these afterwards, because that one's not perfect. You see, there's a tiny bit off on that one. I mean, it's not bad, but my mum wouldn't be happy. Actually, I'm going to go put the seam allowance towards the other side on this one so that they're not going towards the same edge, so that there's less bulk when I join them together. Okay, and then same as before, you can just join up your rows with each other. So I'll place this one on top like this, right sides facing. We've got a little, so you see here, that's a little bit off. That's fine. You're going to have that every now and then, because it's really almost impossible to get everything absolutely precision perfect. So don't worry about it. But just the best thing is to make sure that your joins are lining up nicely. So just check those as you go. So I'll just make sure that I'm happy that that seam is matching that seam really nicely. Put a little clip on there. And then keep clipping all the way along. Because on these long seams, I think it is actually better to, you won't be able to clip around the outside once you're, working with larger pieces of fabric. That's okay. Okay, so last stitching line is going to be a 1/2 inch in from the edge down this side. Sorry. It keeps moving up. Oh dear. Right, I need to be careful here, because if I was to keep sewing and not concentrate, this seam allowance on the top would be flipping over to this side. So just go nice and steadily, needle down, press your foot up, and just make sure everything stays where you want it to stay. Oops. Right. Final press. So all the seam allowances are still going the direction that we wanted them to be in, so that's good. We'll do both sides this time. And hopefully, it looks nice and arrowy on the right side. Yay! There we go. Isn't that lovely? So you want to do one more, push the seam allowance to this side. And press again. Oh, I didn't do that. It's a bit trickier the further along you get because you've got more pieces of fabric to worry about. Oh, do you know what? I think that would make a lovely big quilt, all arrows going different directions on each row, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Looks so nice. And actually using these lovely bold colours, actually they're quite you, Lauren, I think, don't you? Pink and the yellow. Right, so there we go. Hello again. Yeah, so there we go. Right, that was a whistle stop. How are we doing? Okay, we've still got 15 minutes. For squares or rectangles, have whatever size you wanted to, but just sew those, and then triangles as well. Okay, any questions on all of that? And would you like me to talk about binding and or quilting? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Okay. So I'm going to do it really quickly, but it'll be useful. I'm going to do it with the square one because that's going to be more straightforward. So what you do first of all is your quilting. Is your quilting, obviously, and then you need your binding afterwards. So you need batting for your as your middle layer. I always like to use, you can get wool batting, you can get cotton batting. I like to use cotton because I just think, like, wool is nice and warm, of course, but I think it's quite a good idea to use the same threads and fabrics throughout, just so that everything stays the same and nothing kind of, if you need to wash it, all the shrinkage is the same and stuff like that. So this is cotton batting. It's really, really warm. When it was really cold, we used the quilts down there that I'll show you in a minute that my mum made on our beds, and they kept us so nice and toasty and warm. So what I like to do is cut a piece of batting that's slightly larger than my patchwork piece. It's really, really important that everything is pressed super, super flat. You don't want any creases on anything at all. And then you have another piece of fabric on the back. Don't think I've got one large enough over there. I'll just quickly cut one. I'm just going to cut it really roughly with my scissors. Oh, I'm going to need to press it though. Okay, hang on. Okay, so again, I've cut the fabric for the backing slightly larger. I'm not going to bother pressing it, but you will press it really, really well. Oh, do you know what? I'll give it a tiny little press because it's just annoyed me. Just because it's really, really creased. But I'll just do it super fast. Oh, I've turned my thingy off. Okay, that's better. Okay, so everything really, really well pressed. And then what you need to do is join all of those layers together. But before you do that with your sewing, you need to, you can either use safety pins or you can use tacking stitches. So let me just show you. Change camera again. So make sure everything is super, super flat. You need a nice big space, so either a big like dining room table or a nice clean floor or something like that if you don't have like a big craft table. Place them on top of each other, make sure everything is nice, there's no puckers, everything is beautifully pressed. And then you start from the middle and you work your way outwards in various, like in diagonals and in straight directions. So if it's a quilt that's, say, I don't know, up to about maybe 60 to 80 centimeters, so like a mini quilt, up to like, yeah, maybe a meter, you'd be okay with doing that, just starting in the center and going outwards, vertically, horizontally and diagonally in both directions. If you've got anything that's much bigger, you're going to have to start doing more vertical and more horizontal kind of stitches or safety pins. So if you wanted to do it with tacking, with stitches, you just get your needle and thread, start it in the middle and do nice big tacking stitches through all 3 layers up to one end, and then start in the middle again, go down here, nice big tacking stitches, and then outwards and then diagonally. There's another reason why starting with something quite small like this is a really good idea, because it'll just save you a lot of time. If you prefer, you can use safety pins. I've seen people do that. I've never used safety pins. I always just tack it myself because I think it's neater. I think you just get a better effect. You're not puckering up all of the fabric. You want to try and keep it as flat as you possibly can. I think if you put safety pins in, you're inhibiting that nice flat surface. So I always do tacking stitches. Once you've done that and you've got your tacking stitches and everything's in place, you can do your quilting. So there are loads of different ways that you can do your quilting. It's completely up to you. I mean, there are places, if you get really fancy, that you can send your finished piece off to like a long arm quilter person who'll do all fancy designs. But I would, what I start off with doing, so there's this thing called stitching in the ditch, which is quite good. But if you go wrong, it's quite easy to see that you've gone wrong. But by stitching in the ditch, you do a line of stitching down here in that, right in that join, and across here, right in that join. But because if you go wrong and you veer away from the ditch or the join, it's quite good not to do that right at the very beginning. But instead, if you get line up your presser foot with the join and do a line of quilting just offset from that ditch, it means that it's much easier to get a design that everybody thinks looks beautifully neat, and they won't be able to pick out, not that they will, but you won't be able to pick out any mistakes that you might have done. So I would say that offsetting lines of stitching from the lines that you've sewn in your patchwork is a really good idea to begin with. If you'd like to, you can do like say wavy lines or something like that. You can get templates for that. If you were to do that, I would definitely get your template and get your fabric pen and draw it on first, and then follow the wavy lines or whatever design it is that you want to with your sewing machine. Yeah, so that's the quilting step. Maybe I'll just quickly do, oh god, no, I haven't got time because I want to tell you about binding as well. Okay, imagine this is stitched through. Lovely.
Do you use the same foot?
I do, yeah. I just use exactly the same foot. You can use a walking foot if you want to. So have I got one here? I don't think I've got one here. So a walking foot is really good. You don't need to invest in one, but I don't make really massive quilts. If I did, I would definitely use a walking foot. But on a sewing machine, you've got the feed dog underneath that kind of like goes like this to kind of pull your fabric through your sewing machine. If you've got lots of layers of fabric, there's more chance that the fabric layers are going to be pulled through your machine unevenly. So the bottom ones, because they're touching those teeth on the feed dog, they'll be pulled through at a quicker rate than the ones at the top. So if you've got a walking foot, it means that all the layers of fabric are pulled through at exactly the same rate. So you don't need to worry about slippage in the different layers of fabric as you're sewing along. So if you're doing something that's reasonably sized, I mean, even if you're doing something small, I have got walking feet and I could put them on if I wanted to, but I tend not to because I usually just make smaller things. But yes, you would want to use the walking foot if you were doing something a bit larger. They're quite pricey. But they do come with some machines. I'll find that out and I'll put that on the handout. Okay, so say I've stitched, say down there just offset and across there just offset from my my lines of patchwork. Then what you want to do is neaten off everything. So you would line all the layers up on your mat, and this is where it's better to have a larger mat, otherwise you have to do it in various different goes, and you'd cut through all 3 layers to make sure that your quilted piece was nice and satisfyingly it's just gone off the edge of my mat. We go even like that. It always looks really beautiful at that stage. And then you need to do your binding, which is actually easier than what you might think. So to do binding with these, because you're not going right, you're only going around corners, there's no curves to try and negotiate, so you don't need to have your binding cut on the bias. You can just cut a regular piece of fabric. So let me just show you. I'm going to really hurriedly do it, but you're definitely going to get the idea. So I've got a long piece of fabric here. I folded it actually into quarters. I'm going to need to use my big mat for this. It's a bit longer. And I'm going to cut a 2.5 inch wide strip. My ruler gone here, of this fabric. So I'm going to just trim this might not be perfect because we're going a bit speedily, but you'll get the idea. But I'm just going to cut the end off first just to make sure it's nice and straight. So I'm going through 4 layers now. Oh, you shouldn't necessarily do that. That's okay. Just go away from you, don't come back. I was just going through lots of layers. 1, 2.5, 2.5. Well, my ruler's upside down. Oh, golly, I'm breaking all the rules. Right, so I've got a 2. Actually, I'm also going to trim this. And I can show you a corner. Okay, so we've got this long strip of 2.5 inch wide fabric, which has not been cut on the bias. So it's great. There's no wastage. It's lovely. You want to press that in half like this, lengthways, which I'm not going to do, but imagine I have. I'll just finger press it quickly. And then you can start pinning that piece of binding around the edge of your quilt or your cushion cover or whatever it might be. Chop the end off. At the very beginning, you can fold the edge in so you don't have a raw edge. And then, okay, just pop it around. And so what we're going to do is place it on the top of the quilt. So this is the long strip of fabric, which is not cut on the bias, it's just cut straight, 2.5 inches wide. And it's on the top of the fabric, and all the raw edges are lined up with each other. And you start stitching down the edge. Yeah, like that, with your 0.5 centimetre seam allowance. And then if you stop, sorry, your 1/4 inch seam allowance, stop. If you, I'll draw this with my pen so that you can see, because this is really nifty. It's so good. You want to stop kind of diagonally in from there. So I'm going to stop at that point there. Just draw that with a pen. That's diagonally in from the edge. Oh, do you need to even do that? No, you can go all the way to the edge. No, I'm going to stop there. I can't remember. I've not done it for ages. Anyway, we'll test. This is testing my memory of doing it. Right. Get under. Do my 1/2 inch seam allowance. doesn't actually matter that I've not quilted this because it's quite small. So I might end up using this as it is, I think. Be nice. Then you take it out and you fold it like this. So I'm folding on that diagonal, sort of, so back like this, on that diagonal like that, up to the corner, and then back down like this. You might actually want to pin at this point. Do you know what? There's usually pins absolutely everywhere in this place. I'm sure if I search on the floor for long enough, I can't see one. I can only see clips today. Isn't that crazy? Anyway, I'd probably pin that at this point because nothing's going to move now. It's all quilted, everything, you know, nothing, it's all fine. And then we can sew, I'm sure it's right. Yeah, it is. You can sew right from the top down. So yeah, that was correct. So stop at that diagonal point there that we did before. And then that means that you can fold it back up on the diagonal and back down. But then on this line of stitching, you can just start at the top and sew down again. So I'll just quickly show you that bit, and then that will show you the corner. Oh, sorry, it's doing its funny thing. I'll just go down about halfway because you'll get the idea. Okay, and now what you would do, so obviously trim all your ends of thread off and everything, is you you can just fold it over. But look, isn't that lovely? It's so neat. Like, it gives you this kind of automatically mitered corner. So fold it over and then fold it all the way over to the other side. So you want your binding just to go over the line of stitching that's already there, and then flip it or pin it down. And then the final line of stitching, if you're really brave, you can turn your quilt over and do a line of stitching in the ditch on the right side. I'll show you. Or you can just over sew on the back to make sure that it's held down with nice invisible stitching. So if you're not too fussy about it, you could stitch right in that line there on the edge, but I would probably choose to just hand stitch it on the back. Oh my gosh, that was speedy. And then you just carry on obviously all the way to where you, I'm gonna have to finish this now. It's not going to be tonight. Right, so that was so much. Oh my gosh, I'll quickly show you these my mum made because she'll be very happy. But you can see, so she's used loads of different techniques, but there's lots of applique, but actually you can see, so this border here is doing exactly what we did with the triangles. That's exactly how she did that border there. And then obviously she's done loads, like that's our old village we used to live in. And but there's some nice blocks in the middle that are just using squares like that there. I think our old dog's on here somewhere. Is he?
That's amazing.
It is amazing, isn't it? Yeah. Where's I'm sure Rufus was on there. Oh, anyway, and then this was the other one that she made. Oh, there's Rufus. Oh, look at him. Well, she just there's our old house and our old dog. So nice.
Lovely.
Same sort of techniques though, it's just a lot more applique as well. So again, this one around the border, she's done just like squares and rectangles like we did today, and then she's done loads of applique, lots of different animals, but that's all patterns that she used from a book for all of the different animals. So yeah,
That's beautiful.
they're great, aren't they? I
Amazing.
know, she is amazing, but she started
Great
off doing
nails.
exactly, and she didn't start that long ago actually. Doing
Really?
the squares and rectangles. Yeah, no, since like I'd say, well, 5 years perhaps, not very long really. Yeah, she's retired, does it all the time. Okay, right. Oh, considering all of that, we've only gone over by 7 minutes. I feel quite pleased about that. So any other questions whilst I'm here from anybody? Are you all right? Okay.
Make it simple.
Oh, I really try to, because I think, it is a very overwhelming topic, but you've just got to start with the basics, and then you'll be, once you've done like a few
No, it's
squares,
good.
it is so satisfying. I can't even tell you. I remember so vividly the very first thing that I did. It was when Lyra, my now 13-year-old, was really tiny, and I just got some squares of pink and green fabric and made a little quilt for her dollies, and she still got it, and it just made me feel so happy. So yeah, you'll all have that feeling too. So what I'll do is I'll update the handout, and I'll just add a few extra bits on there for you, and then I'll send it through. It won't be till tomorrow now, because I want to add a few bits to it, and I need to download the video, but I'll send all that through tomorrow. And any other questions, please just ask me, and I would love to see your makes, so please send me any
You
photographs.
never know.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
My pleasure. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.